So I am John Hixson. I work with IX Systems, and I work on FreeNAS, and so we're going to talk about directory services. Anybody here that hasn't used FreeNAS? Anybody here that's used directory services on FreeNAS? If you have or haven't?
Used it.
Okay, so with that being said, so I'm a BSD geek. I'm sure we all are. So, and I like to say that I do geeky BSD things. If you were to ask me in my job description, I'm a BSD geek that does geeky BSD things. I'm responsible for the jail system, the plugin system, the SMB stack, and directory services on FreeNAS. So if any of you had anything to do with any of those and you like or dislike anything about them, you can either blame me or you can buy me a beer or two. I work on PC BSD sometimes, but most of the time it's FreeNAS, although I'll probably be working more on PC BSD in the future. I work with FreeBSD as well when I can, and given my job description, that's sometimes and often necessary. And the rest of my free time, as well as my paid work time, goes into working on FreeNAS. Any of you who are not aware of who IX Systems is? Okay, well, we sponsor PCBSD, we sponsor FreeNAS, we have several commuters. I'm sorry, I have a cold and it's pretty nasty. We have several committers on board. We go to several of these conferences every year, and we sponsor them as well. And we give a lot of code back to the community via FreeBSD, as well as FreeNAS and PCBSD. So I'm going to tell you the way directory services works on the technical side. So once you configure it in the UI, from the moment you configure it and enable it, I'm going to tell you how that works. So I'm going to go over the setup, what the operating system does, which is the system configuration, and then once the system's configured and working or not working, I'm going to tell you how you verify that, and then we're going to look at some of the design problems with the current architecture. There's a lot of them, so that might take a little bit. And then some possible solutions. And I'll show you a little bit of debugging, and then I'll tell you how you can get involved. Does anybody want to get involved? I don't blame you. But that's why you're here, so you should want to get involved. So we support AD, LDAP, NIS, and NT4. And if you didn't know, yes, NT4 and NIS people do use. You'd be surprised. NIS, I think some people can understand, like not wanting to let go, but NT4, I can't fathom why anybody would want to use NT4 in 2016, but I still get a lot of requests and bug reports for NT4. So it's there, and I find myself working on that periodically, and every single time it just puts me in a bad mood.
Does NIS also include NIS Plus?
NIS encapsulates all things NIS. I don't distinguish, but I think you know what I'm saying. You're just heckling me. Anyway, I'm going to go over just AD and LDAP because that's what most people use, and it also keeps things simple and this short. So, at the very top, when you go to the UI, this is kind of boring here, but when you click enable, the first thing that happens is that the save method in the form gets called, and from there, our middleware is called the notifier. And the notifier, so it goes down the stack, the form, the notifier, and the notifier calls this shell script, and the shell script invokes whole series of other shell scripts, which is what I'm about to go over. And there's the tools that AD and LDAP use. They're named AD tool and LDAP tool. So, and all those do is they go out, like AD tool, it goes out, it looks at DNS, it looks up a bunch of SRV records, it figures out your AD environment, and if your LDAP environment has SRV records, it'll figure that out as well, and then it will generate a configuration file. And then from there, everything begins. It starts all the shell scripts that do all the various pieces get called, which leads me to the next slide. So there's a good, I don't know, about 10 to 15 shell scripts, I'd say, that get invoked here. And the very first one is the IX host name script. So these things are prefixed with IX because when we first took over FreeNAS years ago, I don't know why, but we somehow just got this IX naming convention and we stuck with it. That's just the way it is. So most scripts that are internal to FreeNAS that do config file generation, they're prefixed with IX. So anyway, this script, all it does is it generates your Etsy host file. And it's pretty simple, but as I put here, so for AD, it adds the short name and the fully qualified domain name, and if you don't do that, it breaks AD. It breaks AD. AD dynamic DNS doesn't get updated. And how many of you have worked with Active Directory? So you know that, like, I'm sure you're aware that little, small, irritating things like that, when something goes wrong, it just breaks everything. So that simple thing keeps AD happy. The next script that is invoked is ixcash, which is just a wrapper around a Python script, and that the generate krbconf py file, it can do a number of things. It will take any realms you have configured in the UI, as well as any auxiliary parameters, and it'll generate the file, or it'll look it up by SRV record. So if you haven't specified anything, it'll go out to DNS, and it'll look up the SRV record for your AD domain, or if you have them configured for LDAP, it'll look it up for your LDAP domain. And it generates your browse file. Next, we have IX NSS switch, and this generates your NSS switch file, and for AD, user and group resolution is done using winbind, so it adds winbind to your NSS switch file. For LDAP, it adds SSS. It can also add, LDAP as well. If you use anonymous binding, it'll use LDAP. If you don't use anonymous binding, SSS will be used. We took out anonymous binding at some point because it's all done in plain text over the wire, and a lot of people didn't like that. And SSS is more secure. However, we found that there's some shortcomings in SSS, and so our people wanted the insecurity, so we went ahead and brought it back in. KInit, ixcash, this gets the browse ticket. AD requires browse, it requires tickets, and so this you have to have it for AD. For LDAP, it's not mandatory, but if you have it configured, you can have preparized LDAP. If you don't use a key tab, you have to. It'll use a password, and what it does is it'll write it out to a file, and then KInit will read in the file. the better way is to use a key tab. We recommend using a key tab, and it'll just use the key tab to obtain the tickets. And you can upload those through the UI. LDAP, keeping with the theme here, it's a wrapper around the Python script. We like Python, that's what we use. It generates both of the LDAP consts. So one of the LDAP consts, which is user local etc open LDAP conf, that's the LDAP config file used for open LDAP when you do an LDAP search, LDAP who am I, all of that. And then if you're using anonymous binding, user local etc LDAP conf will be generated and used. And once again, that's the old method of user and group resolution, but only when anonymous binding is used. It gets confusing when you have two LDAP confs, and it's even more confusing when one of them's when you start symlinking them to NSS LDAP, which is required. I won't go to that though. ixSSD, this is used just for LDAP. There was a time when it was used for AD as well, but once again, too many problems. And this generates a config file for SSSD. SSSD is used for user and group name resolution for LDAP, as well as authentication for the PAM module, the system, and so on. Active Directory. This is what joins Active Directory when you enable AD. It's a simple wrapper around net ADS join, for those of you who are familiar with Samba. That's what we use as Samba. Until there's something else, that's what we use. Once upon a time, it needed a password when you do the join, and that would, if someone were to do a PS, they'd see the join when it was taking place, they'd see the password in the process list. So we figured out at some point, oh, we can use Cabreros. So we decided to use Cabreros instead of making your AD administrator password blatantly obvious. ixPAM, this one is interesting. PAM is painful to get right, especially when you're dealing with directory services, and this does all of the legwork. And for AD, it'll set up PAM winbind in all the right places, and for LDAP, it'll set either SSS or LDAP, PAM LDAP.so in all the right places. I'm sure many of you have probably locked yourself out of your system configuring PAM. So it's best just to let us do it for you, because we know what we're doing. ixcash. This goes out to the directory and it grabs all the users and groups from the directory that are of what's the object type? I'm sorry, I don't remember the particular object type, but it grabs user and group objects and it caches them locally. And this cache, it's what if you ever, wherever you in FreeNAS you set permissions or you have a user and group dropdown, this is what's used right here. So if you're configuring permissions on a share, if you go to the dropdown, you see users and groups, this is what it uses. So once all that's ran and the system's configured, because it always works, it never fails, how do you verify it? So the first thing that I usually do whenever someone says this isn't working, or so and so, do a get-in password, and if you just see your local users, something's probably wrong. Because when you do a get-in password, you should probably see your directory users. So if they're not listed, some of the possible failures are the object type is wrong, the ID in the configured range in Samba is wrong. People like to fiddle with settings that they probably shouldn't, and so if you have a directory that has like a range from like 10,000 to 20,000, and then someone goes and they fiddle with the range and the directory service configuration, and they set the numbers outside of that range, even though everything works, you won't see those users. So the users have to be in that range, and that's one of the problems that we often see is when people fiddle with that. And then less common is it's not configured in an SS switch, and that just means when buying an SSS isn't set up in an SS switch. And that's pretty much the same problem with get-in group. But again, if you do a get-in password and you see users, and you do a get-in group and you don't see groups, it's one of those weird oddities, but this is what happens. And it's often the case that the range was fiddled with. Other ways to test are switching the user to a directory user, trying to log in as the user, SSHing in, and if any of those fails, chances are that the system doesn't know who those are, which goes back to the other slides where any number of reasons. The NSS switch, perhaps the join failed. There's a number of, and even if it does work, if they don't have a home directory set up or the shell doesn't exist, it won't tell you. It'll just spit you out, and it won't work. WB info. This will list all the domain users, and about the only time I see that fail is if the domain join failed or the secret changed. But the secret changing is less common than the join failing. Same thing with WInfo-MSG. That'll list all the domain groups. Same failure case. If everything seems fine, and then you do a winfo-t, and it fails, then that means that the trust account that was created, something is off. And that could be the permissions on the object in Active Directory. It could mean somebody deleted that object. Some of these cases can get really weird and difficult to debug. And we'll get to that. ADS info just it spits out what DC you're connected to. Just some little bit of information about the DC you're connected to. I don't really find that useful when debugging. ADS status, that's a little bit more useful. It gives you the machine account info, and it gives you a whole bunch of debugging information, more than you probably ever wanted to know. But it's useful. PDB edit myself, it's pretty much it works pretty much the same way as the winfo commands do for LDAP or Active Directory, but it does so for LDAP. And if you're not seeing your users and groups when you do this, well, something's wrong. And again, what that could be. It could be anything. But if they don't get printed out, then just know that it's wrong. So that comes over to the design problems. And this is where I get a lot of crap. So as far as the whole whole system in general, it's not asynchronous. So in the UI, like if you click enable directory service, it sits there and spins and spins and spins. Some organizations longer than others. It all depends on how large of an active directory, how slow. Like if you're going over, a WAN, it could be fast, it could be slow, but you sit there and spin until it's done, and it's kind of annoying. And you don't know the progress of anything until it either succeeds or fails. So that's one problem. And if anybody like to help out with that, you know where to go. And if you don't, I'll tell you. The next issue is the password for joining domains is saved in the database. Yes, at one point it was in clear text, plain text, and people didn't really care at that time until they started having problems. And when they started having problems, and we'd hop on a TeamViewer session or a WebEx or whatever, and we'd be poking around the database, and people would see the password and then they'd freak out, and rightfully so. So we just encrypted it, but it's still sitting there in the database, and that's not ideal. And then instead of creating a throwaway account that you just set join privileges on, or they can search your LDAP database, most people use their administrator account, and that's not good, and people aren't happy with this. So that could be fixed, and one of the ways that could be fixed, especially for AD, is just joining the domain one time and then creating a key tab for that and using that afterwards from that moment forward. But that requires a bit of work, which, when things require a bit of work, things tend to get pushed back and continue to be pushed back until it's a priority because everything's on fire. Which leads me to this. So every time you enable Active Directory, it joins the domain. And if you look at NetApp and EMC, you join once. You type your password and it joins it, and then you just forget about it, and everything works seamlessly after that. And unfortunately, that's a limitation of Samba. And I don't know where to go with the Samba part. Samba, I don't know that that'll change, but perhaps if any of you guys work on Samba, you could help out with that. Large directory support. So, I mean, I don't really have an average number, but most of our installations, maybe a couple hundred users to a couple thousand, maybe. But when we get to, we do have some installs where there's hundreds of thousands, and when there's hundreds of thousands, things slow down. For the cache, it requires a lot of memory, and right now there's no real simple way to tune that. You have to edit config files, and those get blown away if you reboot, or unless you know where to edit, to keep it persisting across reboots, but then you go and upgrade and it blows it away again. So, and the asynchronous problem, same thing as I described earlier, and then slowing the system down. I won't say it slows down performance, like when you're accessing a share over NFS or SMB or anything, but if you go to the UI to set permissions, or anywhere where you're messing with users and groups, it has to sit there and load all of these, and it can take a while. And when the cache is caching the users and groups, that for hundreds of thousands of users, it we've seen where it can take an hour or more, so and that's just not really acceptable. And for installs where there's lots of AD sites, the algorithm that's used for determining the site needs improvement for that as well. For small installs, or not even small, but just cases and configurations where there's not a lot of sites, it's fine, but once you start having lots of sites and lots of subnets, it's just very slow because it's serial. It goes, the code, it determines like your network interface, it uses your network interface to determine the subnet and AD, and then from the subnet it has to query to get the site, and it just does a scan, and then, so when you have like 1,000 of these things, it's just slow, and once again, it's just that algorithm could be improved. And the ixcash, where all the users and groups are, there's no invalidation of any kind. You grab everything, and then 24 hours later, it grabs it all again. It wipes it out and grabs it again. And you can do it from the UI manually as well. But like when I was saying, the larger installs with hundreds of thousands of users, this is an hour or longer, and it's sucking up your bandwidth. And there's AD does allow. There's a couple different methods where you can invalidate objects. They're a bit. It's a bit involved, but it's possible, and it's something that we need to do. Because, yeah, once again, that's not really acceptable, and it's not ideal. And we've seen a lot more complaints about this in the last year or two. When you try to enable AD or LDAP and it fails, it just fails. It stops right there. And most people, they're okay with that. It fails. I'll just try it again, or maybe their DC is down. Whatever it is. And ideally, you want it to periodically pull and see, okay, can I join now? Can I join now? Are you up? Are you up? Using whatever kind of back-off algorithm you decide, but something like that should be implemented. And the reason we're seeing more and more of this is because people are using FreeNAS to have like their DCs inside of a jail, so virtualized, or a LUN that another host is using that is using FreeNAS to boot off of. And it gets kind of hard to wrap my head around sometimes, but lots of people are doing it, so it makes sense to me. And and all of this could probably be made into a daemon that, I think that'd be a better design. Right now it's just, as I just went over, a whole bunch of scripts that are just glued together, kind of ad hoc. I mean, that's just the way it's kind of grown over the years, so it'd be nice to start over and do everything the right way, and I think daemon's a good start. Documentation, again, blame me. Code isn't very well documented. Black magic, voodoo, smoke and mirrors are a good way to describe it. Yes, use the source, Luke. The source is the documentation right now. It's very lacking. Anyone who wants to know how this works, you either have to, you just have to go through the code or listen to me babble. So debugging AD and LDAP problems, it's more black magic. It's an art, and there's not the tools that are available right now, there's not much, and that's why this list is short, because most of it is just, it's looking through logs. FreeNAS debug is very helpful. It gives you quite a bit of info, but in the end, you're just analyzing logs. And it'd be nice to have something more, first of all, real time. Second, something even before you click enable, before you even go to any, something that says this configuration is invalid before even trying, or just verifying you have a proper configuration before it even attempts anything. So we need some help with that. Common problems. I could pull up the FreeNAS bug tracker and show you bugs all day long. But some of the more common ones are that users and groups don't show up in the UI, and often it's a very simple problem. It comes down to people configuring the wrong ID map. And it's kind of funny, because the default ID map is RID, and we found a lot of people switching it to AD, so even after I created this nice big dialogue that said, do not do this unless you know what you're doing. And even after doing that, it's amazing how many people still do it. And so that's the most common problem, or that's why that often occurs.
Doing what exactly?
Changing the ID map from RID to AD. Which is something that, unless you know what you're doing, you shouldn't even mess with the ID map. Yes, please take note of that. The directory service doesn't start, when the system boots. More often than not, that's just a timeout issue. So we have a couple of knobs where you can set the timeout, and often it's just not high enough. The default's 10 seconds, but in a lot of environments, it requires more than 10 seconds in order to query all the LDAP servers, do the join, all of that. So maybe the default, maybe it could be bumped up, but that's the most common cause for that. And that, as far as not being able to join the domain, that's the same thing. The timeout, that's almost always the issue. Unable to look up SRV records, you'd be surprised. It's DNS, it's very simple, but most people, when you're not able to look up the SRV records, it's either the wrong DNS server, or they don't have their AD configured correctly, they don't have SRV records. Not being able to obtain the browse ticket, that's a bit rarer, but when that happens, it's usually because, and this is one of those really arcane errors, and it's very hard to figure out unless you run each step of the AD join process manually. It's often that the password is expired for the account you're trying to join as. And it's figuring that out can be difficult. Whenever there's miscellaneous issues, I have it on a post somewhere online. It's, again, more arcane debugging. Going into the database, setting the directory service to be enabled, and then running each script in the whole process manually, one by one, checking the return status of the script and watching for output on the console. That's the current recommended procedure to debug anything that isn't blatantly obvious. The usual mumbo jumbo. I think you all know what FreeNAS is. But yes, it's 100% free and open source network, attached storage operating system. I just updated this slide. The last time I gave a FreeNAS talk, that bottom number there, that was 6 million. So now it's 8 million. I think that's kind of cool. So how do you get involved? because I know every single person in this room, after hearing my talk, you want to get involved because you want to help out with all of those design problems. So you can submit patches. You can do it on GitHub. If you're not a coder, you can document these things. You can file bugs. How you use FreeNAS in your environment, you can document it. And since we're here in Japan, Japanese translations could use some work. So you can help out with translations. Where do you get the code? Get it on GitHub. You can clone it. I think the requirements for being built on 9.2, we just did some work on the build system, so you could probably build it on 10 and 11 now. And the README file at the root tells you this stuff. I don't know how to date that file, so I don't even know if it's been updated. Here's all the places to go. Our website, docs, forum, bugs. We even have an email server. IRC. You can go on IRC and get help. There's a lot of people in there. They know what they're doing. Well, directory services, they're used in a lot of places. I think it's great to have. It's just complicated in implementation, and it's a pain in the ass to debug, but it's necessary. It's great to have a central database of users and groups instead of trying to configure every single box with the same users and groups. So, it's good. And you can set permissions more fine-grained than you can if you didn't have LDAP or AD. And, well, I'm hoping that I've at least given everyone enough of an idea about how it's implemented without going into super technical details, to at least take a look at it, have an idea of how directory services works, and help out with development and debugging, because it's just me, and I don't want to do it alone. Help me out. That's it. Anybody have any questions? You.
Yes. So there are LDAP setups where users can store their SSH public key so that the server can verify once the user logs in. Do you support something like that?
Yeah, okay, the question is, do we store SSH keys for LDAP users? And so you can't do it from the UI, but you can do it like you would any other free BSD system. You can just SCP it over. When you're a directory user and you SSH into the system, it'll automatically create a home directory for you and all that if you don't already have all that set up. And so because of that, yes, you can just create a .ssh, copy your keys over, and do it manually. But no, there's no way to do it in the UI. I hadn't even thought of that. It's a no patch. Anyone else? Yes, Michael, expert.
You mentioned several, challenges, but how many of those are upstream Samba challenges that you inherit?
I've kind of disassociated myself with the Samba project. Well, upstreaming anything, it seems, and in all fairness, I haven't tried too hard, but it seemed at some point very difficult in a lost cause. Maybe the project has gotten more momentum. There's a lot more people. It's moving fast now, so I mean, it might have more luck now. But as of right now, and historically, I mean, I've maintained every time I do, and I do a lot of Samba hacking, and I maintain my own patches, and I finally just forked their repo and started doing it in their repo because the patch sets were just getting out of hand. Did that answer your question?
yes, but are there fundamental issues that where they're doing it wrong? You mentioned caching, whatever.
Doing what, Ron?
That somebody is misbehaving fundamentally.
No, I wouldn't say fundamentally. I mean, Samba, just like any project, it has bugs, and when there's bugs, you point them out. I mean, we've filed bug reports against Samba, and they do tend to get looked at, not always fixed, but looked at. Fundamentally, I mean, it's SMB, it works like SMB. The only, when I brought up the fact that it's always joining the domain, I think it'd be nice to not do that. There's a couple of other things, like I did an update not long ago where if you don't want DNS to be updated with, if you have a box and it has multiple IP addresses and you only want one to be updated, or you don't want it to update, I did an update to handle that because Samba will just do it, and it's very difficult for it not to do it. So no, I don't think they're doing anything fundamentally wrong, but there's quirks with it.
That's exactly the question.
Okay. Anyone else? You.
Any plans for something to change in FreeNAS 10?
Yes, so FreeNAS 10. It's completely different. It's basically a rewrite. So yes, there are plans. This is all changing in FreeNAS 10. I can't speak a whole lot about it because I'm not too familiar with the architecture. It's a moving target. But if you're interested, you can go take a look at our bug tracker because there's milestones that are set. And you can look at the work that's being done. Anyone else?
Do you have any numbers of installation of FreeNAS acting as the Active Directory and not being in the Active Directory?
Question is, do we have
Like
a guesstimate of how many people are using FreeNAS as a domain controller?
Yeah, and how many users they reach with FreeNAS as a...
No. I mean, we actually do gather a lot of statistics, but it's more in how many people are using FreeNAS and downloading. We don't have any metric as far as who's using it as a DC and whatnot. The only way when I was speaking to you earlier, the only way I've gauged that is through the bug tracker, through the IRC channel, and through the forums. I don't have any hard numbers though. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you for coming to my talk. I'm glad.